Part 42 of WCF video series. In this video, we'll discuss the significance of session mode enumeration in WCF. This is continuation to part 41, so please watch part 41 before proceeding. Use session mode enumeration with the service contract to require, allow, or prohibit bindings to use sessions. The session mode enumeration has got three members: allowed, not allowed, required. Allowed. Service contract supports sessions if the binding supports them. This is the default if we have not explicitly specified the session mode on service contract. Not allowed. Service contract does not support bindings that initiate sessions. Required. Service contract requires a binding that supports session. If we use a binding that does not support session, an exception will be thrown. If all this doesn't make sense at the moment, don't worry, we'll be looking at two examples which should make all this clear. We'll be working with the same example that we worked with in the previous session. So, for example 1, let's set the service instance context mode to single and session mode to allowed. Let's flip to Visual Studio. So this is the simple service that we worked with in the previous session, and if you notice our service, the instance context mode is already set to single. Let's go ahead and set the session mode to allowed on the service contract. So session mode equals SessionMode.Allowed. So SessionMode.Allowed is the default. So irrespective of whether we set the session mode or not, the behavior is going to be the same. To be explicit, it's always better to specify the session mode. Alright, so now we have done that setup. We have set the service instance context mode to single and session mode to allowed. Now, if we use basic HTTP binding that does not support sessions, the service still works as a singleton service but without session. Let's actually prove that. So, let's verify what binding we are using at the moment to host the service. Notice at the moment we are using W as HTTP binding. Let's actually change that to basic HTTP binding. And since it's basic HTTP binding and we don't have any specific configuration for that, so we can actually get rid of that binding configuration attribute altogether. Let's go ahead and run our service host. Let's flip to our Windows client application. Let's actually update the service reference, and let's actually build our solution, and let's open the project folder in Windows Explorer, and let's open two instances of our client. Alright, so from client 1, let's initiate a call. Okay, look at that, number 1, and we don't have a session ID. Okay, look at that, both on the host and on the client. Invoke again, look at that, the number is being incremented, so number 1 to number 2, and we don't have a session ID. So from client 2, look at that, so the service is still working as a singleton service. Both of these clients are using the same service instance. The service is still working as a singleton service but without a session. Alright, let's now set the binding to NetTCP binding. So if we use NetTCP binding that supports sessions, the service gets a session and it will continue to work as a singleton service. Let's quickly prove that. So instead of basic HTTP binding, let's use NetTCP binding. So the binding is going to be NetTCP binding. And let's call this NetTCP. And we want to enable reliable sessions, so let's set that to true, and let's specify the binding name within the endpoint, and we want to use this binding configuration, so let's specify the binding configuration attribute. And what is the name of the binding? NetTCP. Alright, so let's close the service host that's running. Let's also close both the clients, and let's run our service host. So the host has started. Now let's get to our client application. Let's actually delete the service reference, Let's add a service reference to our simple service. Click OK. Alright, let's go ahead and run our client, invoke service. Look at that, number 1, and we get a session ID. Click it again, number 2, we get a session ID. And on the server again, we have the same session ID. Alright, so if we use basic HTTP binding that does not support sessions, the service still works as a singleton service but without a session. On the other hand, if we use NetTCP binding that supports sessions, the service gets a session and continue to work as a singleton service because we have set the service instance context mode to single and session mode to allowed. Let's look at another example. So now let's change just the session mode to required. So let's do that. So on the service contract, instead of allowed, let's change it to required. And our service instance context mode is still single, meaning it's going to behave as a singleton service. And we have set the session mode to required. If we use NetTCP binding that supports sessions, the behavior is going to be the same. The service gets a session and continue to work as a singleton service. Let's actually quickly prove that. Let's run our service host first. So the service host is running. Let's go ahead and update our service reference. Let's go ahead and run the client, invoke service. So we get number and there's a session. Okay, so now let's change the binding to basic HTTP binding. And we know basic HTTP binding does not support sessions. So what's the behavior going to be? An exception will be thrown. Let's actually prove that. So let's go to our service and then change the binding to basic HTTP binding. And we don't want this binding configuration attribute because we haven't explicitly specified any custom configuration. Let's close the service host. Look at that, unhandled exception, invalid operation exception, contract requires session but binding basic HTTP binding doesn't support it or isn't configured properly to support it. Okay, so straightforward. Okay, so basically we have different instance context modes and different session mode enumeration values. Okay, and then different bindings that we can use with the service that support sessions and that does not support sessions. So the MSDN link right here, it shows all the possible combinations of service instance context mode values and session mode enumeration values and the end result of using each of those combinations with bindings that does and does not support sessions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.